As we mentioned earlier, we're not doing a formal debate, and we're going to enter into something that's somewhat creative in regards to debate. We're picking up something from television. Crossfire is a title anyway. And our next 15 minutes will involve Mike asking questions of Shebir. And then we'll exchange that and go back and forth a couple of times. And I think you'll find this interesting.
How you doing, Shebir?
Pretty good, Mike.
It's really great to meet you today. Let's see, you started off, well, let me go with what you said last here about the developing legend within the Gospels. You spent some time talking about how the traditions of the resurrection narratives had developed embellishments over time, and there were some legendary additions and so forth, and so therefore we shouldn't believe the accounts at all. In my opening speech tonight, I was pretty careful to discuss evidence that predates the Gospels by decades. In fact, stuff which goes back to the original disciples themselves. And so I think the Gospels are reliable, but let's just say for a moment, in fact, I'd be happy for the remainder of our debate this evening to just concede for the sake of argument. The Gospels are filled with errors and contradictions, we'll say. How does that impact the evidence that I provided, which again comes decades earlier? I mean, it seems to me that what happened is you're assaulting this hill and you're throwing grenades and we're seeing explosions, but I'm on this other hill and I'm saying, what's he doing over there? My army's on this hill. And how would you respond to that?
Well, the evidence which you have cited showing that there was an early acknowledgement that Jesus reappeared to his disciples is not something that historians deny, or that what I have presented denies. You have evidence that there was a blossoming Christian faith. People believe that Jesus is alive. Muslims believe that Jesus is alive. But the belief that someone is alive and in heaven with God does not necessitate his bodily resurrection. In the Gospels themselves, you have it that Jesus proclaims that Abraham and Moses are alive. They're alive with God. But the belief that they're alive does not necessitate their bodily resurrection. So it is quite possible that the disciples of Jesus, witnessing the crucifixion event, later on came to the conclusion, for whatever reason, that God raised Jesus from the dead. And that conclusion does not necessitate finding his tomb empty and knowing that he physically, bodily resurrected from the dead. It is just a faith expression of the closeness that Jesus had with God and the conviction of his disciples that God did not leave Jesus alone to suffer in this horrible way.
I think I'd have to take issue with that, because when we go back to the earliest tradition, like, for example, the creeds, there's several of them peppered throughout the New Testament, but let's just, we talked about 1 Corinthians 15, that he died, and that he was raised, and that he appeared. In Romans chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, and the majority of scholars acknowledge that we have an actual early formula or oral tradition there. It says that he was declared the Son of God with power by the Spirit of holiness through his resurrection from the dead. So in the various early traditions, in fact, that would predate Paul, that predates everything, those references. There are, I counted, 3 creeds themselves within the New Testament that would predate Paul and go back to within just a few years. In fact, James D.G. Dunn says that the creed in 1 Corinthians 15 dates to within months of the crucifixion. So we have very early, and goes back to the disciples. Paul himself mentions resurrection or rise from the dead on 30 occasions. So we have a total of 33 references in the New Testament, very early, predating the Gospels, and a number of those predating even Paul, that talks about Jesus being dead and raised, or resurrection. And of course, as I mentioned, the concept of resurrection, the body that was buried is the same body that's raised and was transformed into an immortal body. And the testimony of the disciples is that's the body that appeared to them.
Well, I think you have to be aware that the creeds that you're referring to, have been identified by scholars combing the New Testament, looking at the writings of Paul. They look at Romans, as you've mentioned. They look at 1 Corinthians. You didn't mention Philippians, but it's there in the back of your mind as another one of the kerygmas that scholars have identified as early statements of faith. But notice that Paul does not say where he got these from. And Paul, in adding his own adding himself to the list of people to whom Jesus appeared, is adding to that list a person to whom Jesus appeared somehow spiritually. Because in the Acts of the Apostles, where the appearance to Paul is described, it is not a physical bodily appearance, but it is a blind flashing light from out of heaven. So once Paul has added that, I think your case becomes weak here, and it becomes more like the case of those who say that the disciples of Jesus must have seen an appearance of Jesus, and Muslims should be willing to grant that God, in order to solace the companions of Jesus, allowed them to see a spiritual vision of Jesus that would persuade them that Jesus is alive with God, so that they can go forward and preach the Christian faith, despite the fact that Jesus died this horrible death, which would mark him off in the eyes of people as a condemned criminal, a blasphemer, and a false Messiah. So none of the evidence you have cited actually proves that Jesus physically, bodily, rose from the dead.
Okay, I appreciate you saying that. Actually, I don't think that what Paul saw on the road to Damascus was a bodily appearance or a spiritual vision or appearance like you're saying. But I'm glad you grant Acts, because if you want to do that, then we'll go to Acts 13, where Paul is preaching as well. And there he very distinctly and precisely says bodily resurrection. He contrasts King David with Jesus, and he says, David died, was buried, his body decayed. Jesus died, was buried, and his body also, but his body did not decay. Rather, God raised it up, and of that we are all eyewitnesses. So in doing so, he's certainly contrasting what happened to David with Jesus and saying Jesus' body did not decay. He raised it up, and we're eyewitnesses to this. Now, if you mention Paul, we have to also say, even if we do take that appearance in Acts chapters 9, 22, and 26, where he sees him on the road to Damascus, and it's the bright light, this is a post-ascension appearance. So that could certainly account why the difference. It's the disciples saw him right after he had been raised from the dead, but Paul is seen after he ascended to heaven. And Paul elsewhere in his own writings is very clear about bodily resurrection. For example, in Romans 8:11, he says, the Spirit who raised Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies. So certainly referring to bodily resurrection there. And then you have Colossians 2:9, where it says, in Christ all the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form, and he's using the present tense, and of course this is after post-ascension, so Paul's view is still that Jesus is in a body. There's numerous references like this, so I would just have to disagree with you that he's referring to a vision or a spirit here. And then in terms of where he got the information from, in Galatians chapter 1, verse 18 and 19, he says that 3 years after his conversion, which would have been about 5 years after the crucifixion, he goes up to Jerusalem to meet with the disciples, and he meets with Peter. He says, I met with Peter, and the Greek word used there is hysteresis, from which we get the English word history. And the word would mean that he went up and he did this historical investigation. He was asking for history of Jesus from Peter. And many scholars believe that this is at the point when Paul received this creed in 1 Corinthians 15 and all this, because he was asking a history of Jesus, and that's where he would have received the information from.
Well, I think you've said it yourself, Mike, that there is an assumption there that Paul got this from Peter, but Paul doesn't actually say that. And we have to assume that Paul got it from there. Moreover, where Paul speaks about bodily resurrection elsewhere, that does not necessarily mean that Jesus' resurrection was of the same sort. You cannot say that because things generally happen a particular way, every specific case happens as the general case. Moreover, once Paul has been added to that list of appearances, you cannot preclude the fact that others received a similar appearance to the one that Paul received, which is something like a blinding light, something like a spiritual, a non-physical appearance, not Jesus appearing in a bodily form, but a blinding light in heaven. And when you put us all together, you realize that what Mel Gibson, for example, has shown in the movie, that Jesus is sitting there in the tomb, and we get a chance to see in the tomb that nobody else has seen 2,000 years ago. This is exactly the kind of evidence we would have liked to have, and we don't have. So finally, we should say that the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus from the dead is lacking. And if Muslims and Christians believe that God miraculously raised Jesus into heaven in a mysterious way that we do not know how, and that we do not need evidence for, but we accept on faith, this would be fine. But you have made it necessary, and other apologists like yourselves have made it necessary to prove that Jesus actually rose from the dead. And this is where you are in the difficulty.
I don't see it as a difficulty because, can I just respond to that?
Sure.
Because the disciples themselves made it an issue. They claimed resurrection. That's what their claim was.
Yeah, but you see, they didn't make this the issue that they must prove. It was Paul who made this the issue. Because it was Paul who said, I've decided to know nothing else but Christ and Him crucified. It was Paul who said, and you quoted him, that if Christ is not raised from the dead, then the Christian faith is vain. But why should it be so? Why couldn't the suffering of Jesus, as in the Passion, be enough to base one's faith in Jesus? Why couldn't all of His miraculous teachings, His healings, all of His beautiful teachings which are found in the Sermon on the Mount, why couldn't that be the basis for Christian faith? Why does He have to resurrect from the dead?
God
Okay,
could
now
have done things any way He
starting
wanted.
to shift questions here, which is part of the intention, to have these parties just unlock and step back a little bit, take a breath, and now we'll shift the initiative at this point to Shebir. He can pick up and carry on, or move on to other topics.
Yes. Mike, in your presentation, you presented what you called 3 irrefutable facts. And they're facts you think that have been agreed upon by everyone. 1 is the death of Jesus on the cross. 2 is the empty tomb. And 3rd, His reappearance to His disciples. Now, if you trace the logic of where I was actually leading with my questions, I've already started the question period for you. Now, where you have actually put yourself in a difficulty here is with first acknowledging that it is historically certain that Jesus died on the cross. Now, the circumstances of His death would mark Him off as a blasphemer. As a Muslim, I believe in Jesus, but I believe in Him by virtue of my belief in the Quran. I've said that in my opening presentation. But what Christian apologists are asking me to do is to leave my Quran aside, to say that this is not historical. I must go with the information that is there in the Gospels, based on which the historical conclusion is that He certainly died under Pontius Pilate. Now, if He certainly died under Pontius Pilate as a blasphemer, as a curse of God, as Paul would put it, and that is certain, and if the evidence for His resurrection from the dead is not certain, but you can say 75% of scholars agree on that, and of course you mean evangelical conservative scholars.
Oh, not at all.
And if you say scholars who study it, you're not referring to scholars who have just dismissed it and do not bother even to look at it.
Yes,
Now, because of course of other conclusions that have already been firmly fixed, conclusions that they know about the history of the Gospels, the way they have been written, and so on. So now, having backed yourself into that corner, you have to provide irrefutable evidence that He also resurrected from the dead. And that is the evidence which you do not have, because you have Gospels which have been evolved over time. The earliest Gospel, the Gospel according to Mark, does not have the ending which we would love to see, Jesus reappearing to His disciples. Somebody had to fix that in later on. You have the later improvements that I've spoken about. How do you respond to that?
Well, as far as the irrefutable evidence, that is a tall burden of proof right there. I don't think we can do that for anything. I mean, we can't prove anything with 100% certainty. I can't prove that I'm 42 years old. For all I can prove, I mean, I was created, everything here was created 5 minutes ago, and we were given memories of events that never took place and food in our stomachs from meals we never ate. I can't prove that that's not the case. What we have to look for is high probability and what is the most plausible explanation for the data. And from what you've given me, you haven't attacked any of the evidence at all. Regarding the Gospels, I mean, you're bringing up the Gospels again, but the evidence I provided is decades prior to the Gospels. And so attacking the Gospels, again, for the sake of our debate this evening, I'm more than happy to grant that the Gospels are totally unreliable and filled with errors and contradictions. I don't believe that, of course. All right, but for the sake of our debate, I'm willing to, because I want to get our debate focused on the evidence, that I presented, which is decades before the Gospels. And so you questioned the death of Jesus, you said. And on what basis do you do that again?
Okay, now you switched the questioning.
Forgive me, I'm sorry. Forgive me. You're in control.
Yeah, first I should remind you, Mike, that I did not say that none of the gospel is reliable. But I did say that the Gospels have evolved over time. And once we peel back the layers of evolution in the Gospels, we realize that in the earliest strata, there is not sufficient evidence to conclude that Jesus both died on the cross and resurrected from the dead, or that he reappeared to his disciples. Once we acknowledge that, and you have the earliest strata of evidence, which is prior to the Gospels, which you mentioned, and we see that in the earliest strata, which you mentioned, there is no firm declarative statement that Jesus physically, bodily raised from the dead, then we can see the evolution even starting with those declarations. From the declarations of Paul,